Hello and welcome to Digital Construction Conversations, brought to you by MBS. I'm your host, Paul Swaddle, and every episode I'll be talking to interesting people connected to the digital construction industry. If you've been involved with MBS through its products, events, publications, or conferences in the last 2 decades, you'll know my guest today very well, Richard Waterhouse. Richard is a spokesperson for MBS and was the exceptionally enthusiastic and vocal leader of the company as managing director and then CEO for over 18 years, leaving his role as chief strategy officer earlier this year. Today we talk about Richard's path to MBS and his view on profound change in the industry, not least in terms of digital development. A chartered architect and originally a user of early MBS offerings in practice, Richard joined MBS and led it through an electronic information revolution as the industry began the adoption of computing over printed and paper-based systems, something he's still passionate about today, on show when he hosted the MBS Construction Leaders Summit in April. Richard's legacy includes his involvement in multiple committees, societies, and working groups to develop BIM and digital construction process globally, educating and inspiring companies and event attendees worldwide, and exploring how UK-centric documentation could evolve into European and ISO standards, and how MBS could adapt its platforms and content for global markets like Canada and Australia. We talk about MBS's relationship to the RIBA and how international growth and transformation through software as a service platforms attracted new investment into MBS, recently becoming part of the Byggfakta Group. It was also the first of these podcasts to have been recorded face-to-face, the delight of which I hope you can hear in our voices. Here's a joyful conversation with Richard Waterhouse. Well, welcome.
Hello.
Hello. It's lovely to properly talk to you again after the Construction Leaders Summit, where it felt as if very briefly spoke to you, but not in depth and not in much detail.
There's so much goes on at those conferences, those summits, that trying to do other things can sometimes be a real challenge because you're very focused on, got to make sure we get this right. Got to be professional. Exactly. So yes, it's great to see you again.
Yeah. What did you make of the event?
I thought the event was really, I would say, fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. As usual, great lineup of speakers and really authoritative in what they had to say. So huge learning. And one reason I like doing those events is I learn huge amounts at the same time. Yeah. And we all need to keep doing that. So no, a fabulous event. And I think great responses from the audience as well. So great thing to do.
Were you able to see some of the sessions afterwards that perhaps you missed as you were presenting? Have you managed to
one of the challenges is we have a short period of time to get over so many different topics, and inevitably that means putting a number of tracks in on the second day. So the best way of doing that is going back to the MBS website, obviously follow up and hear on the bits that we couldn't or anybody couldn't see, go and catch up the other ones later.
One conversation that really interested me was that it's a digital event and that we're running a digital conference, clearly as a result of the pandemic, but whether that will continue or whether we quickly go back to face-to-face events. What are your thoughts on that?
We had a little bit of a technical hiccup, so I actually got the opportunity to ask people that question, of course. And the comments that were coming back were that I think the industry has started to see a slight change in their expectation. That whilst we like getting together in physical events, and there'll always be a need for that, there's also that flexibility of not having to travel to a location, the cost of travel, both in money and in time, potentially any overnight accommodation. So actually there's quite a lot of feedback that said that they would like to see these events, these digital events, continue in the future. Personally, I'd like to see both and have the opportunity to do both, because whilst the technology gives you the opportunity for those occasional meetings, there's something really special about navigating around a coffee break and catching up with people that you wouldn't normally see. So I think that social interaction, technology hasn't really got the right solution just yet.
Yeah, I agree.
The physical's still needed.
That's right, yeah. Even though the presentations and things can be quite well delivered, those social networking breakout times do benefit from face-to-face, I think.
I think they do. And having, there's hybrid is the new in word, isn't it? Is it the hybrid office?
Yeah.
Is it hybrid working? Hybrid conferences as well. And I think the next step in terms of that meeting technology is going to have to be how these platforms merge the physical and the digital together to create a seamless experience for both audience types.
Because I suppose one of the things that, I've experienced at MBS, certainly with you, and is global travel. And, the idea that some of these conferences are all over the world, and therefore there's a sustainability aspect as well as a practicality aspect to that. So whether some of those events will become hybrid and let more people access that information, even though you're not traveling to the actual destination.
And I think that's a really important point, that whole sustainability angle of travel.
Yeah.
Mind you, there's a question of loading and whether if people drop the number of airplanes in the sky, number of trains on the rails, number of cars on the road, do they actually fall? But I think for me, it is all about that flexibility. I love seeing the global conferences.
Yeah.
Although time is usually a factor there, because the one you really want to see is at 3:00 in the morning. But once again, if those sessions then go online afterwards, so you can do catch up, that's not too much of an issue. The bit you miss is the Q&A and the live interaction. But without a doubt, I think we will see more of the things that we've been doing over the last year. More of that will continue than we might expect.
At the Construction Leaders Summit, there were a couple of key themes in the presentations, one of which was the golden thread of information, building safety, and the draft building safety bill. And I know that the golden thread is something you've spoken about for a long time in terms of its necessity and what it can do for the industry. What are your thoughts from the Construction Leaders Summit about that?
Fantastic. And once again, there is so much happening, some which is visible, some that isn't. We're just a few weeks on now from the Queen's speech. So the Building Safety Bill listed in the Queen's speech, so we know that it will happen within this Parliament, which is within the next year. We're coming up to the 4th anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy, and we've got to expect, I hope, the government will have done something before that anniversary. So I'm hoping this is going to be one of the bills that comes through at the start of that parliamentary session, not the end, because it is so vital. And of course, we've also now got some clarity on Gateway 1 within the Building Safety Bill. But these are small steps. I think there's a real need to look at that bigger issue as to what exactly is the golden thread, how tightly will it be defined in legislation, and then what other benefits can it deliver. So the legislation has to be about safety. It has to be about protecting residents so that they can sleep safely in their homes, that whether they are rented, whether they are owned, and know that building is being maintained to be safe. So that's got to be the core of that. But there are so many other things that the golden thread will deliver for us. We'll know what the building is made of. And if we extend beyond safety into other materials, to know exactly what was specified and what actually made it into the building, and what was the decision-making to get from that idea through to the delivery in the built fabric. If we've got to do that for all those elements of building safety, we might as well do it for all the other elements of a building. We also know that through the survey work that's been done, looking at the cladding systems, taking those cladding systems off, we're finding a multitude of other problems. And that actually, that's devastating for the people who have paid for these buildings.
100%.
But it's also damning on the construction industry, on our ability to do the job properly. And I would also hope then that using technology, we can actually capture not just the data about what's going in, but record the built condition. So before things get covered up, there's photographic records, scanning records, so we see what's gone in and that it was actually assembled correctly. Once again, this gives real comfort to the building owners and the building users that the industry, their suppliers, have done their job properly. And the golden thread for me goes way beyond the core need for safety and gives us an opportunity to do all of our jobs properly. I think that it's fantastic.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've understood, from speaking with you for years about this, in terms of having a decision-making process that's made very clear, an audit trail throughout the building life cycle, and to understand all of the various parties that are involved in that process. And clearly there's quite a precise remit to what the golden thread of information is trying to do currently, but the theory, I suppose, is that will expand to all building types or right across the industry in time.
Yeah, I think once again, there's a capacity issue at the start. So the new regulator will have quite a task on their hands, not just in the buildings that will be coming through, the new buildings, but also those legacy buildings, the ones that are already built and need to be tested to see whether they are suitable for occupation, whether they can be certified and allowed to be occupied. And government, if we look at the supporting documentation for the Building Safety Bill, we found thousands of towers that are in their red category just at the moment. So they'll have to be assessed as well as the new ones coming through. So there will be a capacity limitation, a time limitation. And that documentation, I think it says that that's going to be 2023 whilst they're going through that. So we're not expecting this to be an overnight solution. But at some point, we have to extend the scope in terms of residential and then to extend the scope outside of residential property. And I'd rather see it's the way that CDM came in and the way BIM came in, saying that it's got to be done on these core things, but we can expand it in time to ensure that it actually does transform the industry. And that transformation has to happen.
Yeah. And one of the other key themes, I suppose, and one of the panels that was really well received was sustainability and the conversations that were had there. I suppose similarly, in terms of that panel, there seems to be a new acceleration and new momentum to actually put some of these things into practice, whereas I feel as if the industry has been talking about it for a long period of time. From your perspective and your experience, are you noticing that acceleration towards some solutions now?
I think this whole area of sustainability has gone from being a niche specialist area to being something that the industry as a whole understands.
Yes.
They may not have a complete grip on how they're going to achieve the changes needed, but at least the issue is now it's mainstream.
Yes.
And I think that's great. Before you can do something about an issue, you have to be able to recognise there is an issue.
Yeah.
So great, we now know there's a problem. But that problem is multifaceted, and there are solutions for each area. So waste, for example, operating carbon, operating water, embodied carbon, all of these different things. And what we still don't have yet is a real strategy for how industry is going to tackle the big carbon load that we have. It's also the problem is that most of that is from buildings that already exist.
Absolutely, yes.
So we've progressively improved performance targets in terms of new build, but we've had an absolute disaster around retrofit. And that simply isn't acceptable. Government has always done best when it legislates. So once again, CDM legislation, BIM, it's a bit of fudge around legislation, really.
but
anyway,
mandates and mandate
to mandate or not mandate. But when government puts its weight behind something, things change. And the reality is we haven't had enough of a focus. What we do have now is legally binding targets.
Yes.
And a government that appears to want to make a difference. So bringing down the targets in terms of cars and combustion engine, fantastic. But their cycle of change is much quicker than buildings. How long do cars last on average? So by forcing that through, they can get a change over a limited period of time, within years and maybe decades.
Yeah.
That isn't the same for buildings. Buildings last much longer. And as a result, they have to think a little bit quicker about how we're going to really deal with retrofit. Because if we don't, we will not get anywhere near the built environment's targets for carbon reduction.
Yeah, that is so interesting. I've been reading this week especially about the comments made that not all of the technologies that we will need to achieve some of those targets are in place, and many of them are at very early prototype stages and so on. But it feels as if the built environment is slightly different, and that it's about managing the existing stock and improving it, and that's where a lot of the urgency needs to be now.
Absolutely. And having a really simple system for helping people to do that.
Yeah.
If we accept that the industry now recognises sustainability as an issue, that's great. We've made a step forward. We can then try and get the industry to advise its clients that when you're thinking about doing retrofit, it's not just about adding that extra bit. Actually, what you need to do is look at the performance of the whole building. The greenest building is a building that already exists. Well, let's find a way of improving the performance of those buildings. And that's a really hard task because whilst lots of people in the general public recognise green issues, sustainability issues, when it comes to spending money on buildings, it's usually the biggest investment they will ever make.
Yeah.
And it's disruptive for your living accommodation at the same time. So it's hard to do that. We've got to find ways as an industry and with government to make that easy for them to say, that's a no-brainer, let's just do it.
That's fantastic. Clearly, this is a time of vast change at MBS, and I've got lots of questions to ask you about the history and the evolution of the company. And clearly a period of huge growth, particularly internationally as well. But I wanted to start with your personal perspective on the company, and I guess it's always good to start from the beginning. So can you talk about how you first became involved at MBS? I've heard some of the stories before, but it would be good to provide them for our listeners as well.
My first introduction to MBS, I knew of specification through my training. So I trained, like you, I trained as an architect.
Yeah.
And in my part 2 at Newcastle Uni, I first came across specification. It wasn't particularly well covered. It's one of those things that needed to be covered, but actually it does get in the way of design. So didn't really get much of a grip of it. But I graduated in 1991, right in the middle of quite a tough recession at that point. And I was very fortunate. I was offered 2 jobs. Most of my cohort in that year ended up over in Germany because they were rebuilding Berlin at that point. So lots ended up over there. But I stayed in Newcastle and went to a practice called Jeffrey Purvis Partnership. And Jeff's Partnership were one of the original test sites for the first digital version of NBS. A tool called SpecMan 3. It was called SpecMan 3 because Professor Steve Lockley, who led the team, thought that if you just call it SpecMan, nobody will buy it because it's the first one. If you call it SpecMan 3, people will think that it's got some history, so it's okay. And I, as an architect, I was never particularly good at drawing. I got into CAD very quickly. And I did a lot of computing when I was younger as well, so I'd done O-levels in computing. In fact, my twin brother does he's a computing specialist. He does large-scale network stuff. But so we'd done computing through school, that I played with computers, got into CAD. So when I joined Jeff Purvis, I ran the CAD system for the practice. And they also had this specification software. And Jeff's view was, well, it's software. You know how to use software. Do this as well. And SpecMan 3 was relatively simple as a tool, and you could, using some of the little ini files, I could get it to do things I wanted it to do. And also recognizing that some specifications are very similar, but you want to be able to tweak things. I actually started using what we now called Office Masters. So I created Office Masters.
Fantastic.
We had 3 major themes of work. So I created not fully populated, but versions of those project types. Yeah. So when we started a new project, lots of the core things were already in there. And then the bits that are project specific are tailored to suit the needs. Yeah. And it had an updating system even then called Validate, which meant that we could always maintain them, and the rules of keeping the content up to date to latest standards, etc. So I put that system in, and the team at NBS wanted to find out what is he doing? What's he up to? So I used to keep going and finding out what I was doing and how I was dealing with the product.
Real customer feedback.
Yeah. And and I'd just say, well, can you get it to do this?
Yes.
And it got to the point, I did that for 4 years, just over 4 years. And they said, do you fancy a job? Well, actually, it was worse than that. They put an advert for a job and there was a post strike. Okay. And when finally the post came in, this job had been advertised weeks and weeks beforehand. So I'd phoned them and said, it's still there. And I was interviewed and joined MBS in 1995.
And what are your memories of MBS at that time?
MBS was really quite small at that point. I think there were only 30, 35 people above a nightclub on the quayside in Newcastle. So everybody knew everybody at that point. The software was developed within the university here under Steve Lockley. In fact, everybody in the software development team was called Steve. They really were. And then somebody came in who wasn't called Steve and they called him Steve anyway. But it really was a little family. And NBS was very, very heavily paper-based. It was all about binders and discs. We had a service where we would type up the specification for people. So it was well established,
yes,
but really analog. And I was brought in to help push the digital side of MBS.
Yeah.
So going and selling MBS, training people on MBS, talking about digitization as an issue around the country, something which has been at the heart of what I've done ever since.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I could see the opportunity there. It got to the point where SpecMan needed to be upgraded, and I was given the opportunity then to lead that on the MBS side, eventually moving into a product management role, and then taking over the whole of the technical content, and ultimately becoming managing director. So I joined in 1995. 7 years later, I was managing director of MBS. So it was quite a quick, quick process.
Yeah. And did you always, I suppose, have both of those career ambitions in mind? One to move towards technology and computing away from practice, and one to lead a business at some stage?
I think the issue for me is that you always want to play to your strengths, and I'd always wanted to be an architect. I'd always looked up, look above the street line and see what's above the street line. That's what architects do. Try and look at the whole picture rather than just what you see, how the urban fabric integrates. I just wasn't very good at designing it. There are other people in my year who just had a gift. Yeah. And architects, lots of architects have that gift. I was very technically focused. Yeah. And by default, you veer towards the bits where you're good. So I ended up doing something which was the technical side of architecture, and that then led into joining NBS. But the beauty of architectural education is it challenges you to think a different way, to challenge assumptions. And I think in business that's very, very valuable, because it allowed me to think a slightly different way and say, let's challenge that assumption. Is that the only way of doing something, or is there another way? Yeah. And I think that basic architectural education was actually really beneficial in terms of my business education.
It absolutely is. Yeah, I really empathize with that. And I think in terms of that transition, though, in 7 years, that is presumably quite a daunting path, and that it must have been at times, I guess, a pressured environment. Was it a difficult journey to learning those skills and learning how to run a business?
Yes, and fortunately, I was given support. Another key theme of this is training and development. Yeah. So at the early stages, as a young individual, I thirst for knowledge, and hopefully that never disappears from somebody. But it meant that I could learn a little bit more about the field, understand the networks that will allow our business to do the things it needed to do. Then when it came to the business side, I was very fortunate that the business supported me through a course, the Accelerated Development Programme at London Business School. And that gave me the start of my thinking around strategy and marketing and sales, fundamentally finance as well. Finance can be quite daunting, and there are specialists who can really make finance fly. I think as a basic minimum, you do need to understand a profit and loss account and a balance sheet, with a bit of cash flow forecasting as well. So I had that basis, but once again, I had a team around me. You do not need to do it by yourself. It's also about the team you have supporting you, and through different iterations, I've had fantastic people to support me in doing what I needed to do. And it got to the point where I could see where I thought MBS ought to go and what MBS should be. And I had people around me who could make that happen. And that's the essence of great teamwork, I think. And actually, in many ways, that's building as well. That's architecture. An architect has a vision for what a building will be, but can't build it, can't do the structures, can't do the M&E. It requires a collaborative team to be able to do that. And MBS was exactly that. It was that collaborative team.
That's fantastic. And I suppose in a more general sense, when you think about the history of MBS, there was obviously a general need for standardization and a project from the RIBA to look at standardizing specification. Can you talk a bit more about how that ended up at MBS and in Newcastle?
Yeah, so the kind of the long-term history of MBS, 1960s, there was a report looking at the quality of buildings. The 60s were not a great period for building quality and design. There were concerns about building quality, and there was a view that actually what was needed was a national specification. And lots of the institutes talked about doing this, and the RIBA stepped up to the mark. So in 1970, the RIBA created National Building Specification Limited and funded the development of the authoring of the first version of MBS. So the MBS team were based on Marylebone High Street in London, led by a guy called Tony Allott and a few technical authors, one of which was a chap called Colin McGregor. He was the young lad, Colin McGregor. And it took them 3 years. So MBS was first published on the 12th of March, 1973, in a book format. Everybody said they needed it. Great idea. Nobody bought it. So the RIBA struggled along with this for a couple of years and thought this isn't working. It's not going to work. They were getting some money in for purchasing these books, but it wasn't working. They had a few really strong customers who wanted to see this work and pressurized the RIBA to find a way of getting this to work. And their solution was to sell it to the directors. So that the directors believed in it. They had faith in MBS. So the RIBA sold it to those directors, Tony Allott, Colin McGregor. They were both Geordies. And the first thing was, right, we've got to reduce the cost base. We still need the people. Let's move it to a lower cost centre. And Newcastle became the home of MBS as a result. So they moved it up to the very unfashionable quayside at the time. The quayside in Newcastle was not a place anybody would want to go. Above this crazy nightclub, just take a floor there. Also in there was a printing company. They got their print machines on the floor in this building, Mansion House Chambers. And they kept it going. So they started to expand the services that were offered, kept the print costs down because they were using the printers that were in the same building as well. But the real change came in the mid to late 1980s. At that point, the industry was looking again at how can it improve interoperability of data. Data in those days, of course, was a word processor putting stuff on paper. And we needed to coordinate this more effectively to create a coding system. And that became the CPI, which is Coordinated Project Information. And that led to the common arrangement of work sections, which was the coding system used by MBS, the same coding system used in the Standard Method of Measurement 7, SMM 7, and also the coding annotations for drawings.
That interoperability that you're...
So that was BIM.
Yeah.
That was BIM, but paper version. Yeah. And that ignited the use of NBS.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, people could see how all this stuff fit together, how you link the descriptions in the bill of quantities that are going to be priced with the requirement in the specification and where it goes in the drawings. And it just, you looked at that and said, this is great, this works. And MBS started to take off.
Yeah.
So MBS was rewritten completely between 1987 and 1988 onto the common arrangement of work sections. Around the same time, 1989, that's when Steve Lockley and his team at Newcastle started looking at a digital version. Because now we've got a structure, we can actually start to think about digitizing it as well. So developing the first digital version of NBS. And that first version, their test came out in 1990.
So how did that partnership take place with the university and the informatics team?
So Colin McGregor, very, very good at networking, knew Steve Lockley. They got, probably in a pub somewhere, they got into a conversation about, well, there's a possibility of doing all of this. Because Steve was also looking around Europe, about the things that are happening around Europe in terms of digitalization as well, and could see that actually what they needed was a data source to digitalize. Yeah. NBS has got this massive data resource. Let's find a way of working. So they had a go, and it worked.
Yeah.
This was a really successful way forward. So what turned out as a research project became a viable commercial offering.
And everything since then has sort of been a technological evolution of that same concept. So the core principles of standardized template specification has always remained. And it's been technological evolution since
Absolutely. Then. And the business, the technological evolution from that has been refining what had been done. The business also refined. So the RIBA recognised actually this was something that was really quite important and brought back NBS in the late 1980s. So around this pivotal moment around the late 1980s. So NBS is now part of RIBA. Then we hit the downturn, and that downturn was quite dramatic in terms of the performance of other elements of the RIBA. So the RIBA Journal, they had other businesses as well. And in the end of 1993, they brought them all together in one company. So it became what was RIBA Companies. The journal was pushed off to be published externally. But this was the rebuilding of the RIBA and its ability to generate money. So Tony Allott then became chief exec of RIBA Companies. Colin McGregor is still in MBS. Chris Daltrey had joined quite early on as well. He'd come in from BRE. So the key players there, they recognised that things needed to change, and they decided, right, we need to do something around this digital stuff. And that's where I appeared.
Yeah, and you've always been an advocate that even with that technology, that data still is central to the conversation, and that it's about the quality and the robustness of the technical information.
Fundamentally, the content is at the core of everything. That content has to be right. It has to be useful. It has to be comprehensive but concise. The 7 C's of specification.
Yeah.
I think I wrote that in about 1996. But it's got to be coordinated, correct, concise, comprehensive, etc. And if it's not, it doesn't do the fundamental job it needs to do. It needs to be able to take an idea, somebody's requirement, and pass that to somebody who can make it a reality. And you do that in as clear a way as possible. And the specification is by far the best way of doing that. But at its heart, everything is about content. When I was still drawing on a drawing board with rotary pens, it's content. Yeah. It's just the content is in a physical medium.
Yes.
What we've done is take it from a physical medium into a digital medium, but it's still the same stuff. It's how you link this stuff together and how you make it really simple to express your ideas and your requirements and get somebody to deliver it for you.
Well, one thing that you've been a real catalyst for is international development and international growth, so that those same, I suppose, quite UK-centric principles originally were expanded, and we now have growth in Canada and in Australia and elsewhere too. What was your mentality in terms of thinking this could work elsewhere in the world?
the fundamentals of what we do are the same around the world. There are slight differences in process, but the idea of communicating a design to a contractor who will then build it is the same everywhere around the world. And using data to make better decisions is a requirement wherever you go in the world. The paper process has created barriers to trade. It's difficult to move when you have different archaic processes. Very, very embedded processes. Digital transforms industries. And another thing I learned from London Business School was how to spot opportunities for transformation and then how to look at delivering that transformation. And what we could see in the kind of mid-2000s was that transformation of different industries. So Amazon disrupting the book selling market originally, now disrupting everything. But we could see the transformation of the video industry into originally moving into online and streaming.
Yeah.
And the same had to happen to construction.
Yes.
It's just, once again, we have this built-in inertia because our project cycles are so much longer. But I could see at that point we needed to do something. We were part of the International Construction Information Society, so I could see what was happening in other places around the world, how organisations in different countries were either advancing or not. And so that gave a market-based understanding and a customer-centric view as to what was needed or what wasn't being provided. And then to see how we were changing, because we'd already gone through different iterations again of our software products. That data still at the core of it. And around 2006, had this awful, awful moment where I realized actually what we're doing wasn't good enough. What we're doing was not sustainable for the future. Common arrangement was great because it created this coordinated set of information, but it didn't allow some of the things that our customers were starting to really need. Performance-based specification on systems, on elements. Because there was no concept of elements in the common arrangement. We had to change. It meant it was time to look at rewriting MBS again.
Yeah.
And in this case, actually, rather than just moving everybody onto it, giving options around, do you want to write specifications based on cores and common arrangement, or do you want to move to a systems and elements-based specification system? So it was time to look at doing that. And also, one of the first jobs I'd done when I joined MBS was work with Autodesk in the UK on a thing called Annotation Manager, which linked our specification database with what was AEC 5 and AEC 5.1 and AutoCAD Release 13. We needed to do that again. We needed to link this data more effectively digitally. So it was time to evolve again. And that was the start of the process that led to MBS Create and the National BIM Library. And once again, this same theme again, creating standard sets of data that can then be linked together. We're really fortunate that a couple of years into pressing go, because it took us 4 years to rewrite MBS. A couple of years into pressing go on that, the government came up with their BIM initiative.
Yes. Yeah.
That was helpful.
Convenient time.
Because that created demand for this highly structured data. And that meant as we got these products to market, the market was ready to use these tools. Yeah. And the use of MBS as a result really started to skyrocket again.
And undergoing a wider digital transformation in its own right and applying these new tools.
Absolutely. And recognizing then that the construction industry is a global industry. So our designers, our contractors, our product manufacturers all work in multiple markets. And there's a built-in inefficiency of having to learn different ways of working in different markets. Yeah. Digitalization allows you to step over that, to transform that, and to have a consistent playing field in terms of how you operate. That's standard. So I managed to look at where we should be placing people to help us understand that standards activity and how we can influence that standards activity. So I joined the British Standards BIM Committee around 2007, 2008, and actually ended up chairing it from, I think that was 2013.
Absolutely.
But recognizing that the UK was doing this amazing work in terms of creating the 1192 series of documents. But there was a risk to UK economy if at a European level or at an ISO level, different standards came in. We needed to be leading that work. And once again, fantastic work done, particularly by Anne Kemp, in pushing that into the ISO and the EU framework. So allowing us to have some consistency, some parallel with the work that been done in the UK and seeing that placed into the international markets. Clearly, it couldn't be one-to-one. It had to be changed slightly because it has to work with other international requirements. But it meant that UK methodology, the overall idea, was pushed into many other markets. And that helps everybody. Those markets who need standardization, because lots of them were already taking the British standards. They were just adopting the British standards in other international locations. But it then meant that for businesses who want to work in multiple markets, they didn't have to learn new ways of working. They can take the ISO 19650 standards and apply them wherever they go. The only bits that are different are the things that need to be different because of local material supply. It might be to do with the meteorological conditions, etc. But the fundamental processes are the same.
They're the same. And I suppose there's two themes that come out of there that I'm interested to talk about. One is BIM and its development, and we'll come back to that. But one is partnerships and integrations with, you mentioned Autodesk and other integrations that MBS have now, but also very, vast partnership arrangements. One that I was really interested to talk to you about was the IHS market and the development of the Construction Information Service. Now that's a huge global organization. Can you tell me about how that relationship came about?
Yeah, so IHS they're now based in London, funnily enough, but were US-based over in Denver. They bought this small entity in Bracknell called Technical Indexes, TI. Everybody knew TI, microfiche. You want a standard? It's on the microfiche. And for those of a certain age, they'll remember the microfiche readers. It's data. Yep. And then there is data about data. So there are the standards, and then there's all the data you need about the standards. And MBS was working, no, it wasn't. It was actually the RIBA information services were working with Technical Indexes on how to index all these standards and write abstracts so they could be found more effectively. And then when RIBA Companies was formed and pushed together, it was obvious actually the best place for that relationship wasn't in the information services team, it was actually in MBS. So at that point, a huge amount of work done to actually bring the TI relationship into the MBS world. And that happened, around 93, 94. Building on that relationship, at that point, the idea of having, rather than microfiche, having this on CD would be a great idea, because everybody's now got CD drives in their computers. We don't want this old technology. Let's go for the latest technology. So once again, Steve Lockley and team, then they're brought in to actually write the indexing software.
I see.
And then to actually fire up the right image on a particular CD so you could then view the standard. And what this is doing, it's putting the right information at the fingertips of an individual when they need to make a decision. Yeah. So in the specification, it will say, you should be doing this to BS 1234. Well, wouldn't it be great if we could look at BS 1234 straight away? Yeah. And then linking directly from the MBS guidance. So then we started to look at how can we integrate that much more effectively. The next stage, obviously, was to put that online. So putting that as a cloud-based resource, so you can simply click on the link and it will show you the standard. No more having to go and find that CD from the pack of 30 CDs that you've currently got. So a much more effective way of working. And it was transformational. It was great for the specification customers because they could immediately have access to tens of thousands of technical documents. Yeah. MBS had already worked out which of those documents were important and why, and making it really easy for you to then read more. Because MBS can only consolidate some of that to a certain extent. Cool. You then have to follow the link and go and read more.
Read the standard itself.
Read the document, whether it's a standard, whether it's a technical report, whatever it might be. but to have that at your fingertips. No more walking around the office, going down to the library. It's a much more efficient way of working.
The other integrations that's really powerful in the MBS ecosystem is the one between manufacturer's information and specification, and the kind of relationship between MBS with manufacturers and MBS with specifier end users. How did that arrangement and that symbiotic relationship kind of develop in the time that you were?
So when I was still in practice, we had access within SpecMan 3 to the card index. Yeah. So this it looked like a digital card index. Right. Hilarious. All it did was give you the name of the manufacturer and a name of a product. So really interesting, not very useful. Because what you need is the product. Remember, everything in a specification ends up as a construction product. Mm. So there is an intrinsic link between the specification and the product. It's just a question on different procurement methods.
Yes.
When does that decision get made and by whom?
Yeah.
So we needed to find a way, and the creation of RIBA companies brought product information into one business alongside MBS. It was RIBA Product Selector.
Yes.
And it was really obvious to me at the time that had to be part of MBS. But politically within the company, that was problematic. There were factions within the company. We couldn't get hold of Product Selector at that point. What we could do is we could start creating a specification version of product information.
Yes.
And that's MBS Plus, or was MBS Plus.
Yeah.
Which was to take manufacturers' product data and reorganize it so it fits the specification structure. And it makes it really easy to swap the information in from another source of information. And we launched that, I think, in 1998, something like that. And it was an almost instant hit because, once again, it just makes sense.
Yeah.
Make the product information easy to find, organize it so that the product information you show is related to the stuff you're currently looking at.
Yes.
And you will find the information you need. So it just worked. Then when I became MD of MBS and ultimately chief exec of the whole company, one of the first things I did was say, right, all this product information needs to be in one place. Because it was rather maddening that as MBS, we were managing product information, and in the product selector, we were managing product information. It's the same stuff, different databases, different editorial teams. We needed to bring it together. And that's important because product information, like the specification, changes during the project lifecycle. At the early stages, you need to know what this looks like because it's probably an aesthetic you're looking for. At some point, you're going to need to know performance and what it will actually achieve and whether it fits a requirement for performance. And then ultimately, purchasing and maintenance. So we needed to scrunch all of this stuff together. Yeah. And that took years. And the reality is the launch of MBS Source was the actual time we finally got it right.
Yeah.
And all of this stuff is highly structured, highly organized. So it takes years sometimes to do this because you've got to keep maintaining a service, both for the manufacturer and for the specifier, whilst transforming the data structures underneath. So
I guess to some extent, is that how MBS Chorus and MBS Source feel to you? Is kind of a culmination of a lot of development over perhaps decades, really getting to a cloud-based solution where everything is in one place?
Yeah, I think every step you take in business is a step forward, although sometimes it can feel like a step back. And you've got to know where you're heading. You've got to have a vision for what you want to be. You've got to have a mission for how you're going to get there. And ultimately, what we now have as MBS is that it's still the start of the vision, of course. We've not finished it. This is never a finished entity. But what we've got is cloud-based tools. So it's use anywhere, whenever. And it is the two data sets that are intrinsically linked in that you've got the specification for a product and you've got the product data that is absolutely matched to meet it. It is so easy to link these together. Then wrapped around that, you've got other data that will help you, like the standards, technical and regulatory information. There's so much more, though, that we need to also wrap around that. We've talked about sustainability. So, okay, where's the carbon data? Where's the water data? What about any constituent parts that might be dangerous? So we've got all of those things, COSH, etc. Then you've got things like cost information.
Yeah,
then you've
absolutely.
got program information, availability. Wouldn't it be great if I need a particular type of brick? I need 1 million bricks. And I can immediately find out who's got, well, nobody's got 1 million bricks at the minute, but immediately find out, I can get 1 million bricks tomorrow, but it's going to cost me 10 million
Exactly
pounds.
right.
Or I can get 1 million bricks in 3 weeks' time, it's going to cost me 5 million pounds. I can do that with so many other systems in other sectors. I can't do it in construction yet.
Yeah.
That's maddening.
It's that intelligence and the ability to make decisions with all of the information at hand that you need to make those decisions.
And it's all about making decisions, making sure that you have the information on which to make a good decision. That's at the heart of MBS. It always has been. What we can't do is make the decisions for our customers. We can give them as much help as possible, but it's got to be the customer making those decisions.
So, Richard, you've mentioned that MBS was formerly part of RIBA, and clearly the last few years have seen a huge period of change and new owners and new investment. What's your perspective on that and that kind of recent history?
Well, it was a tumultuous period for MBS, and a transformative period for MBS again, because once again, businesses need to keep reinventing themselves. The world changes, and if you don't change, you get left behind. So then the question is, where do you want to be on that change curve? Do you want to be at the front of it, or do you want to be bounced along by it? And it became really clear during the mid-2000 teens, whatever we call those. MBS was growing really quickly, but being owned by the RIBA had certain limitations on the business, namely that we gift aided all of our profit back to the RIBA. And that's great. It makes us feel warm and comfortable that we're supporting the architecture of the UK. As an architect, I think that's really important. But we're operating in a very competitive environment, in a digital arena that's transforming rapidly with many organizations who want to do the sorts of things that we wanted to do. And that requires investment if you want to stay ahead of that curve. That investment's really hard when you're giving effectively 100% dividend back to your shareholder.
Of course.
Now, as a business leader, as a director of the business, you have to look at, is that good for the long-term survival of this business? And then for the RIBA, they had to look at and say, is this going to provide us with the long-term income that we need? And it became increasingly clear that something had to change. So the RIBA employed KPMG to do a review and to test the strategy. Things we were talking about, were they right? And then options for the future. And obviously, as we now know, the option that then happened and the process was to sell part of the business. So that NBS was bought by a company called Williams Topco Limited, and the RIBA still maintained a shareholding in that, along with private equity investment from Lloyds Development Capital, LDC. That's the private equity arm of Lloyds Bank. And it meant that we could then start reinvesting in the business. And from that, relatively quickly out of that, we already had the development of MBS Chorus underway. So actually the launch of Chorus came just a few months after that development. But what it did allow was the investment into the next piece, which was the product information platform, so MBS Source, but also this push into new markets as well, and to demonstrate that we could take our platforms and populate with other data sets, namely an Australian library for the Australian market and Canadian data that we already had through an earlier acquisition of Digicon. So we now had a platform with 3 major data sets: British and European standards in the UK, Australian and New Zealand standards in Australia, and Canadian and some American standards over in Canada as well. And that created another opportunity for growth, then adding product information to it as well. So this was all part of our our plan. We needed to get in the cloud, so we needed to build the platforms in the cloud, create these multifarious data sets that can then, it's not about where the organization is, it's where the project is. So you can specify a project in Sydney, even if you're working in the UK.
Yeah.
As long as you know the rules, of course.
Of course.
But it created that flexibility. So here we are, we've got investment. We've managed to do the things we said we were going to do. We achieved all the things we said we were going to do. And then COVID was the driver for people to want to operate collaboratively in the cloud.
Yeah.
Because we're all working from home. Well, how do we keep working?
Yeah.
Well, let's work in a shared space. This was another amazing driver for MBS. And I think it was one of the directors at Microsoft said that for many industries, 2 years worth of transformation took place in 2 months.
Absolutely.
So, and we all, we know it's a better way of working. We believe it's a better way of working, but convincing your customers to transition is always hard because they have to learn different ways of working, different tools. And COVID was the driver for that rapid transformation. And all of a sudden people thought, do you know what? This worked. And there are huge opportunities. At this point, then we've got to look at, well, who is the right owner for the business? And are there other owners out there? And that led us to the transaction with Byggfakta. Byggfakta are a really, really interesting organization. They've got the same sort of thinking in terms of data because they come from the product side of data in Sweden. But also that through their acquisition strategy, looking at other tools that will fit as part of this. And MBS was an obvious choice for them to consolidate some of the things that they've been doing. And it leads us on to the next big issue for construction, and particularly in digital construction, which is the fragmented nature of construction and the fragmented nature of different data providers, different technology providers. If we look at the CAD world, that consolidation has taken place. We've got the major players, Autodesk, Trimble, etc., Nemetschek. We don't have that in the data side of the construction industry.
Interesting.
And that, without a doubt, will happen. Every industry goes through this.
That consolidation,
you
process.
end up with the big 4 or 5.
Yeah.
If we can see it in CAD. If you think about automotive, you think about aerospace, think about accountancy.
Yeah.
You can think about the big 4 or 5.
Yeah.
We don't have that yet in our world. It will come. And what I can see with Byggfakta and their backers in TA and Capital Square is that ambition for scale. Yeah. And that undoubtedly will continue to make things better for all of our customers because that scale makes things easy. That's what scale gives you. It allows simple integration between different processes on the construction timeline. And I think that's hugely, hugely exciting.
It is immensely exciting. And clearly your role has changed during that time as well. In terms of the last few years.
Obviously, change takes place during all things. And I was delighted to be able to lead NBS for 18 years. But at some point, everybody has to recognize that it's time to move on. It's time to let somebody else take over and run that the way they see that being done. And the acquisition by Byggfakta, I think, was time for me to say, okay, time for me to step down. I've been doing this for nearly 26 years. And I still like to think that I've got an innovative thinking, that I'm challenging, pushing, etc. But it's a different environment, and that scale becomes more focused on the leader of the business, not just trying to do business management and do the kind of technical thinking, but to recognize more specialization needs to take place. Yeah. So it was a time for me to say, I'll step away at this point. But what I can do is still help NBS. So just on the bits which I find really interesting, the thought leadership, the conferences, etc. It's all about keeping that thinking going and keeping the ideas going. But to be honest, not having to worry about the day-to-day delivery.
Yes.
So actually, that's really
quite nice.
That's really quite nice.
I thought that leads neatly, I suppose, onto your approach and your philosophy in business and in management and leadership. Do you have a style that you're conscious of?
That's usually the interview question. What's your management style? And I always used to think benevolent dictator, but it's not that really. It's recognizing that as a business leader, you don't have all the answers.
Sure.
It's about creating an environment where people can come up with the answers for you. And quite frankly, as a leader, bask in their glory, but also always ensure people know where that came from, who owned the idea, whose thought it was. That's not to say, it was their fault. It's to recognise that people have done great work. If you do that, you create a number of different things. You create teams. You create teams that want to work together. And as long as they know what the objective is, what the shared goal is, they'll pull together and they'll deliver that. You give them the opportunity to come up with those ideas and to grow individually. And you also give them the recognition they've done a good job. There is nothing better to build an individual but to say, that's really great. Also, you've got to be honest with them and say, actually, that's not really great, and guide them. And if you do that, you will grow great people, you're great managers, great team players. And you can probably tell from the answers I've already given. For me, collaboration and teamwork is everything.
Yeah.
If you do that, when people start to fail, you don't have to step in because you know their colleagues will, and they'll pull them along. At some point, sometimes you have to say, enough's enough. And that's hard. That is hard. Yeah. But on the whole, you find more successes than you find failures.
Yeah. And I think not only do I think of you as a team leader and somebody who has generated great collaboration, but I think one of the things that's so integral to your personality is enthusiasm, and the fact that you are an enthusiast. You're not at arm's length to the industry. You're not kind of looking at it from a distance. You're very much an enthusiast of the construction industry developing digitally as well.
Yeah, I think in anything you do, you have to believe in what you do. If you don't believe in it, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
And if you really believe in it, you will do more. You will get things to happen. And in business speak, that comes back to vision, mission, and values. You want to do something, but how are you going to do it? What are the rules of doing it? Will you trample over anybody to get there? Or will you operate in a way where you are true to your values? And I really do think that is so important, because that's the bit that creates the culture.
Yeah.
And if you create that culture of learning, of development, of support and enabling, you will have a business that will do well, assuming, of course, that the environment in which you're operating hasn't just fallen through the floor. And I've had that happen to me a few times as well.
Yeah, because you mentioned the recession in the 90s where you were introduced, but clearly there was a huge financial crisis and a global recession that you were also leading the business through. That must have been an incredibly difficult time.
Well, I've been through that a few times, actually, because the same thing happened in 2002. We had a mini recession there. We had the great financial crisis, of course. At that point, we had the RIBA recruitment business within our portfolio. That fell by 75%, almost overnight. But I had brilliant advice from the chairman at the time, a chap called Clive Carr. And Clive was always hugely supportive of what I wanted to do. And he said, you have to take the tough decisions and take them early, because if you do that, you will be better prepared for what comes next. And that part of that was transforming the business, and that meant losing people out of the business, unfortunately. But we always did that in a way which was fair. We tried to find out what the best solution would be for everybody. But it did mean losing headcount from the business, transforming the structure of the business so that we were better prepared for what came next, for the upturn. And the upturn would always come. It's making sure you are ready for that upturn. So we'd invested in the products. We knew that during 2010, 11, 12, that good times would come back. And when those times came back, they came back really quickly at that point. Our competitors weren't ready. And we were. So it's not all roses. There are tough decisions to be made, but when you have to make hard decisions and you've got to find ways of reducing cost base, which usually means making people redundant, I always said that we would do that in as good a way as we possibly could, because you should treat people the way you want to be treated yourself.
Yeah, and having been through that.
Yeah, and they are not decisions to make lightly.
No.
But you do it as well as you can. And you also have to recognise sometimes you just have to do it because you've got to protect as many other jobs and the business as a whole. But you can do that in a very fair way, and that's really important.
And I suppose, again, in terms of looking back, you've mentioned some failures as well as successes. Are there things you would do differently and lessons that you've learned that you would think, if I could do it all again, I wouldn't make those decisions?
Yeah.
That's not all I'm going to get.
There are so many where you think, oh, shouldn't have done that. Or should have done that better. One, I'm not going to name it, but one was an acquisition that I wanted us to do. It was around cost information. And it was entirely the right thing for MBS to do. And I just didn't convince the board. And to this day, I still think that was the wrong decision. But that's the board decides. Yeah. It's not my decision. And you can only reflect on that and say, what could I have done better? How could I have positioned that so the board would understand why I think it's a really great idea? I didn't do that well enough. I was just not good enough on the day. But hindsight is an amazing, amazing thing. If we knew then what we know now, would we have done it the same way? No.
Yeah.
Is the easy answer.
Of course.
But I think if we look at where MBS is now compared to where it was, the IOD have this, Institute of Directors, have this thing that as a director, you should always leave a business in better shape than you found it. So I can look back over those, the 18 years I was running it, the 20 years I was a director, I think I've done that. I've ticked that one.
Thinking about the future of MBS and how you've mentioned a few things, cost information, carbon information. What is your hope for MBS in terms of the future and where it can go next?
I think fundamentally it is underpinning the decision-making through the life cycle of that project. And that's not just through the start of the project, its inception and the commercial thinking, through briefing, through design, delivery, and then operation. I think MBS has the opportunity to underpin using data to make the right decisions at the right time. I've got a real thing about the building operation phase, because I think that's where the problems of the industry are really found, where the emissions of the industry are demonstrated. And it's an area which simply hasn't had enough focus. And I think that's an area which is ripe, really ripe for some interesting technologies. So this whole thing of digital twins and sensor technology, monitoring technology, using that, not just to improve the performance of that building, but to use that to improve the next building or the next iteration of a building, I think is really fundamental. At first I didn't quite understand digital twins. I've got to say, isn't that BIM? No, it's not. I get it. Get it now. So that's really, really interesting, that whole area. But then the other integrated data sets that also need to come in, because if you take that core philosophy of have the right information to make the right decision at the right time, MBS doesn't have enough information yet. It's great for the stuff it's already got, and it's doing a fantastic job of that. But there's more can be done.
And you've mentioned it a couple of times in terms of UK BIM and its international development and I guess the digital construction journey. But from your perspective, how have you seen digital construction evolve? What was the early iterations that you were seeing and the first time that you encountered terms like BIM? Can you look back and think that is a decade of real progress in the industry?
Without a doubt, the last 10 years have been... It's been quite a ride. Been quite a ride. But I said earlier on, I can't really draw. I'm just rubbish at sketching. But CAD for me was always the way forward. And the first time I saw something which really changed my view was when I was trying to understand how to organize data in CAD. And I came across an Arab guide to layer management. And this was fantastic. All of a sudden, I could understand how I can exchange data with CAD data with my structural engineer.
Yeah.
Because I could never find out where he put stuff. And I said, well, let's do it this way.
Yeah.
And we'll have a standard way of doing it. I thought, wow, this is interesting. And I was doing this in 3D already because it's easier to do it in 3D. Well, my brain tells me it's easier to do it in 3D than it is in 2D. So that's when I first saw it. When I first see BIM around the early 2000s is the first time I started to see that. And hear the term being bandied around, although it was another one of those things where actually all it was CAD. Nobody really thought about the information,
the data
bit,
underneath,
you know, and we kept trumpeting it's the I in BIM. Even now, too often we see people interchanging BIM with a 3D model, a non-integrated 3D model, and I find that hugely frustrating.
Yeah.
Because that's going to get you nowhere. It just shows you where things go.
Yeah.
It doesn't actually allow you to build anything.
Yeah. And interrogating that data.
Yeah. And what do I do with it next? Our industry is maturing. It's still in terms of digital construction, it's still very immature.
Yeah.
You know, the fact there are thousands of different players in the market tells us it's an immature industry. But it's getting there. Yeah, every year we get thousands more graduates who get data.
That's right.
Who understand data. Thousands more graduates who can start using programming languages to do things a different way, who understand sources of information and using information. And over time, we will see that transformation. It comes back to that same theme. For construction, transformation cycles are much longer than other industries.
Yeah. But with, you know, those kind of McKinsey reports and things that we see where construction seems to bump along the bottom with agriculture and other things that perhaps naturally aren't very well digitized, do you foresee us shooting up to the top echelons of that kind of a report of how well an industry has digitized? It's just going to take a while to get there.
I think you've got to be very careful with the McKinsey reports. And they're great. And they're great pointers for us all. They do tend to be heavily focused around the US and what we actually see is the US industry, not necessarily the global industry. And if we look at the digitization of the industry, Europe is leading the world in terms of, and that is Europe. That's not the UK.
Yeah.
It's Europe is leading the world in terms of that digitization effort. There are real hotspots elsewhere around the world, and undoubtedly in the US, there are fantastic organizations who are doing amazing things with digital, and the same around the world. But the consolidated effort in terms of standardization that is being driven through Europe is changing the environment, the digital environment around Europe. And you see some very innovative organizations who do really clever things. You just go, yeah, that's great. That's really good. But we see that more often now in Europe than elsewhere, simply because of the environment that's been created.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions left for you. I suppose outside of MBS and outside of work, what's next for you? What are your next steps?
That's a really, really interesting question. It comes back to that whole thing about what's your vision? What do you want to achieve? Realize I wanted to specialize around technical. I could see how data could change the world. And I still want to do that. I still want to change the construction industry. I still want it to improve. And I can help do that with the thought leadership side, with MBS and chairing the conferences and finding great speakers who we can ask some really probing questions. That's fantastic. There's some other bits I'm already talking with a number of organisations about some other bits that I might want to do. Whether I want to do that all the time is another matter entirely. Of course. And it's how can I best use my time now to have that impact. I also have a house project. So I bought a house that needs quite a bit of work. I'm in the fortunate position I can now do the things that I've actually believed in for some time. So I want to get this to be zero carbon. So that's ground source and it's a PV array and things. And I'm going to actually put my money where my mouth is and actually do it.
Fantastic.
So, but that's already throwing up a number of issues. And I get really frustrated.
It's not a small project either.
It's not a small project, but it's also the trying to make it easy to actually go zero carbon.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
In fact, there's hurdles in the way.
It's too hard to go zero carbon.
Yeah.
So who knows? I might find myself doing something around that as well. But it comes back. The principles I have, in many ways, I suppose, I applied to MBS.
Yeah.
It's like, we're going to focus on this. We're going to focus on making things more efficient. I'm applying the same principles to my own project now as well.
That's brilliant. My last question is always the same, and I suppose it's in two parts, and it's about your hopes for the future. And one part is the future of the industry. So we've talked about digital twins. There's obviously modular on the horizon. There's all kinds of developments in sustainability. In first part, what are your hopes for the future of the industry?
It's interesting. We talk about modular, talk about off-site, modern methods of construction. They're fundamental. We haven't actually talked about those in this.
No, that's right.
And yet they are a key part of the future of construction. Moving construction from a building industry to an assembly industry is the easy way to look at that. And it's another no-brainer. Why build something when it's 1 degree and the rain's coming in horizontal, certainly in the northeast of England, when you can do that in a factory where you can do it in as efficient way as possible. The quality is absolutely spot on, and any waste can be recycled effectively. It's just no-brainer. And it is more than possible to create great architecture out of consistent building blocks.
Sure.
And they're the assembly pieces. So that whole thing, the thing around platform, etc., is fundamental. And I really like government's approach now, so presumption in favour of off-site modular. But once again, that's an immature industry. It's going to take years for that to mature. And we've got to find a way of accelerating that. So what do I hope for construction? I think for me, it has to be that we're all using data, that we freely choose to use digital tools rather than fall back on analog processes. And I'm afraid, I probably shouldn't saying this as somebody who's led MBS, actually that's cultural, not technological. And I think my real hope is that actually now we, as well as spending money on maturing the technology, we actually invest heavily in people. And find ways of breaking down the cultural barriers to delivery, because the technology is brilliant. It really is. MBS stuff's fantastic. I would say that, wouldn't I? But the technology is fantastic, great tools, and over time we'll link those tools more effectively. But it's pointless having great tools if the people won't use them. And that is right the way through the supply chain, not thinking about this purely as a design stage, right the way through construction and operation. We've got to make it really easy to use these tools.
And then the second part is hopes for the future more generally. It could be about the wider world, social things, environmental things, your own personal philosophy.
Been able to travel outside the UK. That'd be nice. It's interesting having my career has been spent travelling. Whether that's travelling around the UK. I think I've been to every city in the UK. I think probably, and all the time travelling. Increasingly then internationally.
Of course.
My passport feels lost. I don't think it's been outside the drawer for over a year. So. And I do miss travelling, although we've once again with any form of travel, we've got to balance that with the impact of that travel. Seeing a bit of sunshine, would be quite nice. But I think generally the world. I actually, you know me, I'm an optimistic person.
That's good.
I have a huge amount of optimism for the world. We've got to vaccinate the world. We've got, as we're seeing, if you don't vaccinate, iterations of the virus will come back and it will bite us. Because we'll find iterations that the vaccines don't work and they have to be re-engineered to actually work, and that just compounds the problem. So we have to vaccinate the world. But I think we've got the will to do it. I do believe that. It will take time, but we'll get there. And then to be able to just get back to somewhere close to, it's not normal.
No.
It's the next normal.
Yeah.
Because we've moved on.
Yeah.
And as we say, our whole lives are based on change. We've moved on to the next normal, whatever that will be, but let's get there sooner rather than later.
Yeah, it's an opportunity, isn't it, to do things differently.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Richard.
My pleasure.
Absolutely not. An ideal guest. 2 hours of quality content.
Well, 2 hours of content.
Humble as well. Humble as well. Thanks hugely to Richard for his personal perspective on 25 years of MBS development and his passionate views on future themes for the construction industry. It's a chance to thank him too for his impact on my career and the opportunities he's opened up over the years. I wish him every success with his next adventure. I hope you've enjoyed listening to our conversation today. Please subscribe to the podcast on your chosen listening platform and press like or leave a review if you can, helping more people to discover these episodes. If you have any feedback or suggestions, or you think that you have a unique perspective on digital construction and that we could have an interesting conversation, please contact us at podcast@thembs.com. Until our next episode, thanks and goodbye.